Before we get started, we have to give just a brief disclaimer here. So number one, these are our views. This is Brian and I's views. This is none of what we say is going to reflect the opinions of the Department of Veterans Affairs. And the materials provided in this webinar are for general information and educational purposes only. They're not intended to be legal advice or opinions. No attorney-client relationship is formed by attending this webinar, and you should not act on this information without first seeking legal counsel on your specific matter. And I've got to say these other things. Attending the briefing does not guarantee successful assessment or accreditation for the CMMC program, and this presentation is being recorded. All right, got that out of the way. Brian, what are we talking about today?
Well, good morning, everyone. I know there's several people still rolling in here. The participant number is going up pretty rapidly. So again, my name is Brian Gunther. I'm the founder president of Exceed Cybersecurity and IT. And today we are talking about this four-letter word. It's called CMMC. And I would imagine many of you are here today to learn about what this is. And we're going to really talk foundationally and from a basic perspective through the lens of compliance, which is what I'll talk about, and then through the lens of the law, right? As far as contracts, what Jason's going to talk about today. So just to be clear, this is meant to be foundational, basic intro to CMMC, what it is, where it came from, and what you as small and disadvantaged businesses need to know if you're going to enter this space and what you have to do to kind of get ready for all of it, okay? Sound good?
For sure.
Excellent. So you can see the agenda here, pretty basic. I'll just breeze through this really quickly, kind of do a speed run through it, as my son would call it. He's a gamer, so he'd say, I'm doing a speed run through the agenda. So what is CMMC? How does it apply? We're going to talk about the history, like where did this even come from? What CMMC 2.0 is all about? What the impact on you, the US DoD contractors are. Now, you may already be existing contractors. You may be thinking about getting into that. So that has an impact on you, right? And also the challenges facing you specifically as a disadvantaged small business. Some of you might be very small, again, thinking about getting into this and what that means and what the risks and advantages are. And so then we're going to end the whole session with Q&A. We're going to do about 40 minutes or so from this point forward of content. I can talk about CMMC for hours, and I know Jason can as well from the legal side. So we're going to try not to bore you to death if we can avoid it. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into it, the next slide. And so first of all, Jason, tell us a little bit about the DIB and the DSC. What is that?
Yeah, so you're looking at DIB is the Defense Industrial Base, right? And these are, and it's also, and then, you know, is someone, a DSC is someone who's seeking certification, right? You want someone out there who's looking to get part of this, right? This is something where it's like, if you are in this space, if you're looking to be a defense industrial base contractor, right? Someone who is contracting with the DoD, this requirement is gonna start popping up everywhere. And I want to be clear, like the rules say, even if unless it's a COTS item, which is a commercial off-the-shelf item, and that's exclusively, as it says in the rules, exclusively a COTS contract. You won't see this, but almost everything else you're going to see it unless it's below the micro purchase threshold. So again, there's so many different thresholds in there. The micro purchase threshold, I think, is $10,000, right? So a lot of contracts you might be receiving are going to be well above that, even if it's below the simplified acquisition threshold, which I think is $250,000 right now. It's still going to apply, right? So there's a lot. This is a huge requirement. And look, we got the next thing in there is maturity levels, FCI, CUI, all these definitions. So Brian, what are we talking about here with CMMC? What are these maturity levels? What's FCI? What's CUI? And take us away.
FCI, CUI, oh my, right? There's so many acronyms, and those of you who worked with the government agencies know, especially the DoD, it's a darn acronym soup. You got to get like a PhD in acronymicity, right? If that's even a thing, to kind of understand this. But let's first of all talk about CMMC. What does that acronym stand for? Well, let's start with that. Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So if you kind of weed through that first term, it says a lot within just a few words, lots of syllables, but a few words, right? And so essentially what that means is that defense contractors, to be very clear, it's part of the defense supply chain, the defense industrial base, those defense contractors, whether they're prime contractors that have a relationship directly with the DoD or what's called a subcontractor, right? A little further down the chain, whether it's a tier 1, tier 2, and further down, they have a requirement to safeguard the government's data. that's what this is all about, right? I mean, it's about safeguarding the government's data because they care about it. Why do they care about it? Well, because guess what? Our adversaries, foreign nation states, threat actors have been eating our lunch for a long time, hacking into supply chain companies and stealing information. So that's the big picture, right? And so that's really what the DoD wants to do here is to make sure that the sensitive information that you as defense contractors, as part of the supply chain, hold is actually protected. So that's the big picture, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the maturity levels. So maturity level 1 and maturity level 2, ML for short. So maturity level 1 is about safeguarding FCI. That's federal contract information. Some of you may know this if you've already seen contractors. If you have a contract directly with the government, you're going to be handed contract information, right? That's about your relationship with the government. And that's what you're protecting under maturity level 1. That's fairly simple to do. We'll talk about kind of the levels and how many controls are in there later. And then for COI, that stands for controlled unclassified information. Now, this is a bigger deal. This is really where kind of the rubber meets the road, and where there's more sensitive information, again, that the government wants you to protect and not fall into the wrong hands, or not be accessed by people that do not have authorization to do so, as they call it, explicit need to know in the government. So I'll hand it back to you, Jason. So talk to me a little bit about NIST 800-171 and kind of where that came about versus the final rule. Let's talk a little bit about that last bullet here.
Yeah. So NIST is the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and they are just basically, they're part of the Department of Commerce, and they promulgate rules and standards that the federal government uses. And also again, 800-171, this is their special publication, 800-171. This talks about non-federal contractors. So they have these standards out there. And that is basically the bulk of the cybersecurity standards that the NIST is saying, hey, if non-federal, non-government actors should use. Now, the government has its own standards that NIST has promulgated as well, but these are the ones we're really concerned about here. So NIST supplies the rules, and then the DoD wants you to follow those rules. And how do they do that? They do that via contract, right? They're going to have a contract clause that says you need to follow this. And so for the DoD, and I'm sure if some of us here are, if you already have contracts, especially if you're working with CUI, you've seen this in your contracts already, which is they have a DFARS clause, which stands for the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, DFARS, and it says, hey, under Section 252.204-7012, right? And we're going to call that just 7012 because it's a whole mouthful to say the whole thing every time. But under 7012, it requires you to have you're supposed to make certain cybersecurity steps, right? You're supposed to provide adequate protection, adequate cybersecurity. And what does that, and what in that clause, it says, hey, use what you find in NIST 800-171 to provide that adequate security, cybersecurity.
Hey, Jason and Brian, before you finish, I'm sorry, I not mean to cut you off. It was just stated that somebody stated that Jason is loud and clear, but Brian is a little low and kind of muffled on that end. So I'm not sure if we picking up. I can hear you loud and clear.
Let me ask you this, Jason and Curtis, can you both hear me well?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, so it may be on the other person's, and I'm not sure. I can't say that for sure, but if you can both hear me clearly, I don't want to necessarily go and assume that it's bad for everyone. So I don't mean to in any way. I have limited options, right? So I'm on my laptop in a hotel room. I'm at actually a CMMC conference. Go figure, right? But if you wouldn't mind, please maybe turning up your volume a little bit. My apologies. There's very little I can do because I don't have my office set up with me. I'm on my laptop itself, so I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, maybe it's because of that. They say you're a little muffled, but you sound fine on my end.
Okay, all right. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the next slide here, and we'll start hitting a couple more items there. All right. So, Jason, just a second ago, you talked a little bit about what these contracts mean, right? And so, really, what you're saying, Jason, is that these contracts are really a legal relationship, right? You're creating a contractual relationship between yourself and the federal government if you are a prime contractor, correct?
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. And I think just quickly on this piece, right? So we talked about the standards, right? And then let's talk about CMMC because that's the big hot thing going on right now. And remember that last C stands for certification. So basically what the government has done in DFARS 7012, is they say, you need to apply this adequate security, you need to have this adequate cybersecurity. And the certification process is, hey, that's the government then checking to make sure you've actually done what you said you're going to do. And I think that's the big thing here, because when you look through the comment sections on the recent federal rules that were published, right, the final rule just came out for the CMMC program, and there's another rule about amending the DFARS rules in anticipation of CMMC. And there's questions like, why is this seems like a duplicative requirement. It's not a duplicative requirement. The NIST, the 7012 is saying, make sure you have the adequate security. You're going to do it. And the CMMC says, hey, we're going to double check to make sure you actually did that through either a self-attestation or a third party certification, right? So that's the big thing here, right? We need to have that. Going back to contracts here, right? Yeah, understanding what your contract means is a big portion of this, because unless your contract has these clauses in them, these things don't apply to you. And again, we're talking about DoD contracts only. So if you're talking about another agency, there's definitely things in the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, that discusses cybersecurity requirements for broader agencies all over the place. And agencies may have their own supplemental cybersecurity requirements. So be cognizant of that. But really, you have to read your contract, right? If it's not in your contract, it doesn't apply to you. So that's, I think, a very, very, that's the starting point really for most lawyers is, what does the contract say, right? But you'll be surprised, people say, oh my gosh, I have to do all this. Like, well, does it say to do it in your contract, right? So if that's in your contract, what should they be doing, Brian? How are people going to prepare for this? How are they going to continue to ensure that they're providing that adequate cybersecurity and getting through the certification process?
One of the bullets says here, it's a great question, Jason. So essentially what it means is that again, we're talking about defense contractors, like Jason, like you just said, right? We're not talking about other agencies or departments, right? Just defense, DoD. So it's important to understand that this is a full-blown security program that is safeguarding the confidentiality, only confidentiality, that's what's concerned about, of this information that the DoD wants you to safeguard, okay? Whether it's FCI, federal contract information, or controlled unclassified information. We'll talk a little bit more how that gets deeper in a minute. We'll go a little more into the weeds. And so it's not just tools and tech. Yeah, I got antivirus, got a firewall. That is not enough. Not even close, okay? And we're not even the same universe, galaxy, certainly not the same solar system, right? I mean, these are really dramatically raised standards that you now have to adhere to either win or retain contracts with the DoD. So we'll go into the next slide here and jump into this. And I'm going to talk just for a couple minutes just about sort of the history of CMMC. Where did this come from? Why do we suddenly have to do this? This seems all a little weird, right? And I'll kind of talk about the relevant piece that Jason shared with us a couple minutes ago about the DFAR 7012. You see that kind of like in the middle there, right? So where does it all begin? It all began in 2004 after, 9/11 happened in 2001. Now, hard to believe, 23 years ago, right? It's a long time. On a personal note, it was like literally a month before my son was born. He's now 23, which is crazy. But the 9/11 Commission report came out in 2004, and that essentially, amongst many other things, illustrated some of the reasons why 9/11 was able to be successful for the terrorists attacking the U.S. And one of them is that they identified there was not enough information sharing between agencies, especially intelligence agencies. There's many of them. And so one of the things that came out of that was creating the ODNI, right? The Office of Director of National Intelligence, to try to collate some of the data information. That information was more readily shared with one another and not siloed between different departments, right? So Homeland Security was built after that, right? Actually, it was shortly after 9/11. And so that's all part of that. So they said, well, we need better information sharing. Well, 2005 to 2009, Jason talked about these NIST special publications, right? NIST 800-171, NIST 853. These are all pretty large security standards that government contractors and the government itself must abide by in order to make sure they're staying in compliance with these federal regulations, right? And so move to 2010, at that point, under then President Obama, there's an executive order that was signed that effectively defined what controlled unclassified information is, what it is, giving definition, giving it terms, and then actually saying, okay, this is the initial step that was created to kind of start controlling the information flow and what would happen with contractors within the DoD or with outside contractors. Fast forward to 2016 and 17, this is where the DFAR 7-12 clause, Jason talked about it previously, was started to be finalized and implemented into DoD contracts and the prime contracts. This is where the requirement began. So I want the folks that are on this call here today pay very close attention, is that CMMC, the requirements that you have to follow today that are about to roll out, again, that are now ensconced in federal law through regulation through 32 CFR Part 170, is not new. Okay, these are requirements that DoD contractors, if they held CUI and it was in their contract, already had to do, but they were generally not done. And now we're getting to 2017-18 after a Department of Defense Inspector General audit and sort of spot check around defense contractors found what happened here. Well, they found out that were these DFAR 7012 clauses implemented? Were these cybersecurity controls implemented and policies implemented? And they found out no, they weren't, because there was really there were no teeth to the DFAR's clause. There was no enforcement. This is what CMMC is. It is the enforcement side of an existing clause that has been around for many, many years. In this case, 6, 7, 8 years. Okay. Then the CMMC program was released in 2019. It's version 1.0. It was updated into version 2.0 in 2021. That took it from 5 maturity levels down to 3, a little more, a little easier to manage. And then now we're in 2024, right? The second to last bullet here. It's a finalization of Title 32. That is going live next month, December 16th. And then next year, sort of in the first half of next year, that's where the requirements to have the CMMC audits will start being included in federal defense contracts. All right. And so there's going to be a rollout phase 1 through 4 over the next 4 to 5 years. And this is the timeline that, and I would encourage you, if you haven't already, take a snapshot of it. If you want to take a screenshot, feel free to do that. That would be helpful, I think. So this is the history of CMMC, right? So we're going to go into the next slide here and talk a little about these different maturity levels. So Jason, why did the DoD through CMMC create these maturity levels? Can you give us sort of a foundational primer on that?
Yeah, depending on the information that the DoD is giving you, whether it's federal contract information, controlled unclassified information, or controlled unclassified information that the DoD has designated as, hey, this is something pretty important, right? They're going to say, depending on the level of information you have, right, we're going to say you have to have at least these level of controls, but the higher the information, the more the DoD wants that information protected, the higher they're going to ramp up all the security controls, cybersecurity controls that you're going to need. And so, again, we can, generally speaking, right, you can say, hey, level 1, that's going to be FCI, right? If you have federal contract information, which is a very broad definition, you're going to have to follow, you're going to have to be level 1 foundational certified. Level 2 is CUI. And then level 3 is that special CUI, like that the DoD has said, hey, this is some stuff we really need to have some pretty significant controls on because we don't want this getting out. So you're thinking, nuclear information, other, kind of schematics of weapons, things of that nature, where it's not necessarily classified.
Sensitive information, right?
Yeah. So now, again, as a lawyer, I'm going to say, okay, the clause that you're going to get about in your contracts is going to say, hey, we anticipate you getting CUI, so you're going to have to be level 2 certified. Hey, we only anticipate you having FCI here, so you just need to be level 1 certified. I can understand that, but when it comes to all the various things, right, the actual practices, the actual controls that need to be put into place, Brian, tell us a little bit about that, because that's what you do. You are the cybersecurity expert here.
Right. So we're a cybersecurity and compliance company. That's what we do, right? Is my audio still okay?
I can hear you. So.
Okay, very good. So yeah, this is what we do, right? So our focus here, folks here on the call, is effectively to help organizations to better understand what they need to do in order to comply with this regulation, right? That's our objective. And so at maturity level 1, you have what are called, it says 17 practices, but really it's 15 practices under FAR 52.204.21, which is actually kind of almost like a truncation of the other clause that Jason mentioned earlier. There's 15 controls or practices that you have to implement in order to protect federal contract information, or FCI. Those are not necessarily very heavy. You don't have to have written policies in place. It's not required for maturity level 1. And it also doesn't require actual third-party certification or attestation, right, by a certified third party. And by the way, those auditors, we call them certified third-party assessment organizations. For short, C3PAOs. And no, it's not R2D2's friend. That's somebody who actually has an accreditation and has the ability to come in and audit you. And without that audit, which by the way only happens at level 2, right? And this is where we're talking about a lot more. Now we're talking about 110 controls as part of NIST 800-171, revision 2. Those 110 security controls, policies, processes, by the way, I want to be very clear about this. Not all of these things are technical. Some of them are policy related, they're procedure, they're about documentation, artifacts. Some of them are physical security related issues, access control. Some of them are people controls, right? About how your HR department does things. How do you onboard and offboard people, right? Do you have very clear defined policies and process around that? That's really, if you're in level 2 and have to safeguard CUI, that's what the auditors want to see. They have a very clear definition around that, okay? So, and that's maturity level 2. And, you know, it's estimated that about 1 in 4 organizations need to be maturity level 2 out of the DoD organizations. Very, very few have to be maturity level 3. And what that is level 2, and you put that third Lego brick on top. That really means it's an additional 24 controls that are outlined in NIST 800-172. NIST 800-172 that are kind of bolt on top of the NIST 800-171 controls, and that gives you a total of, I think, of 134. And as Jason said before, that is mostly about safeguarding controlled technical data, controlled technical information, CTI, higher levels of CUI where you're dealing with more sensitive data like nuclear, such as Jason outlined before. So this is part of that process and what you need to implement. But then when you're done with all that, what are you going to do then, right? Then you have to talk about certification. So, all right. So let's go quickly through this, Jason, if you don't mind, kind of hit these high level and kind of talk about the reason why the DoD wanted to implement these. This kind of outlines that quite well.
Yeah, and I think that the DoD has an interest in securing information it shares. I think we all have, I would say that as an American, you have interest in making sure this information is secured, right? And so the DoD, and they go through and they talk in these rules, they talk about why they're doing this. And they know that, hey, if we're making sure that these controls are not only in place, but we are checking on you, like, again, trusting but verifying that you're doing this, it's going to reduce risk of data breaches. And that's what we're trying to prevent here. We're trying to prevent this information into getting into the hands of our adversaries, right? Whether they be state or non-state actors. And so one of the things here is this is going to start becoming a gate that you have to go through in order to get DoD contracts, right? So that's compliance will be a prerequisite. The rules are going to say that at the time of award, right? At time of award, you have to be certified. Okay, so that might be a huge lift for some, but there's a silver lining to this cloud, right? And I think we can talk about this a little bit later, that if you have this certification, you are going to be one of the few, and initially, of course, that's going to have an opportunity to go after more contracts, or even if you just want to deal with subcontracts, having that certification is going to open the door to more prime contract. More prime contractors are going to say, hey, this is the team I want to be a part of because they've got that certification. So again, while there might be an upfront cost, an upfront pain to getting your systems in compliance, there can be a lot of goodness that can follow. And then on the back side of it, right? So this is where, on the legal side, if you look in the rules, it says if you don't follow these rules, you do not stay in compliance, you do not do your assessments, you do not get your certifications, the government will use standard contract remedies. That's what it says in the rule. And what those are is they can terminate your contract, and they're not going to do it nicely. They can terminate for default or for cause, depending if you're commercial item or non-commercial item contracts. They can say, hey, look, we're not going to renew. It just depends. They can give you a bad CPAR, but you see that down there, it's like, hey, the other implications. There's some Georgia Tech FCA. What is FCA? It stands for False Claims Act. Remember, when you're signing those invoices saying, I'm due to get paid, government, you're saying that you've done everything in that contract that you're supposed to have done. And there's been a couple of cases that have come out lately. One, Georgia Tech, there was also Penn State, where former security officials from those universities said, look, these guys weren't doing what they're supposed to do. The False Claims Act allows someone to be a whistleblower for the government and say, hey, I'm going to bring this to you. I'm going to relate, they're called relators, this information to you. They can file a complaint. They can share in some of the damages. But the government says this is one of the ways that we're going to police companies and organizations to make sure they're following the rules. We'll do this. We have a False Claims Act tool here. The DOJ has said that they're emphasizing cybersecurity practices as part of this. And False Claims Act hits you with treble damages. What does that mean? Treble meaning 3 times. So if, for example, you had a $1,000 invoice and you were not following everything you're supposed to, it can be considered a false claim. Then the government come back and ask for $3,000, right? So imagine you have a couple $1 million, $10 million. Those damages can add up quick. And in some of these complaints, right, these big universities, they may have lots and lots of DoD contracts and have lots and lots of DoD dollars, right? Same with several, there are larger companies, right? So it really behooves you, one, to avoid getting terminated, right? Getting bad performance evaluation reports, or getting sued for under the FCA. There's a lot of things there that this is very important to make sure you comply with. And that's why it's good, one, to have a good cybersecurity professional to help you get there and to keep you there. Because again, you have to continuously reassess annually. And two, when something doesn't go right, I just got a call the other day. There was a attempt of a hack, and was CUI involved? Do we have to go and have to drill down into the contractor's information systems to ensure, hey, was it something that was a covered system under DFAR 7012? We go through that analysis, right? So then there's reporting requirements if something does go wrong, right? So anyway, compliance is key because one, having it gets your foot in the door, and two, staying that way, make sure you stay out of hot water.
That's really important, isn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, you got to reach it and you got to keep it, right? And I like how you said, Jason, kind of call that, I sort of relate to that story as, having a competitive advantage and being one of the earlier ones to certify. I call it the carrot versus the stick, and if I don't want to just hit you with the stick to punish you. It's more about how can I incentivize you to kind of get on this early. And like Jason said, if you do that, you have much more opportunity to become a prime contractor. Let's say you've been a downstream sub. Now you can become a prime because you've proven to the government we got certified, and therefore you check that box, which is a pretty big box now, right? So moving along to the next slide here. Sorry, I think I skipped one here. Nope. Oh, we actually finished the last slide here, but there are a couple more things I want to share. And that has to do with the kind of the requirements that you take on as a defense contractor. And I want to just mention this and make this kind of very clear. It's really important that you look inside into your business and identify how much business you currently do with the DoD or how much you project to do going forward. If we're talking about, again, in this case, we're talking about the small and disadvantaged businesses that are looking to either move in this space or stay in this space and what's required for that. And so often what I'm asked in different conversations is, well, what's this going to cost me to level up to where I can actually get to the point where I can become certified? Jason, I know you hear that a lot as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so the leveling up is really taking a good hard look at how much business are you doing with the DoD today? Because I can share with you in no uncertain terms, if you need to be maturity level 1, your expense is estimated to be somewhere in the $30,000 to $50,000 range to get there. That's with the compliance work, with consulting services. Now, in some cases you could do it yourself and you may not incur any cost or much of any cost. And I'm sure your IT service provider can help you with that. However, if you're maturity level 2, it's much more complex. And I do not recommend that any organization, defense contractor, try to go that on their own unless they really know what they're doing. And this is not a play for your business, but it's really more about, I don't want you to get into trouble, right? Or maybe think you're making progress and you're going really down the wrong path, okay? And the expected amount of investment for someone who hasn't done any of the initial 110 controls, like Jason talked about DFAR 7012, right? That initial regulation that was in contract starting 6-7 years ago. That has to all be done. And then for maturity level 2, you then have to be certified or assessed by the certified third party assessor, right? This external auditor. And the estimated cost for that, even for smaller businesses, can be upwards of $100,000 to get to that point. And that is not an insignificant lift. And I'm sure that's probably the understatement of the day, right? That's pretty significant lift. So you have to really think very hard, long and hard about, do I get enough money from DoD contracts or anticipate enough future revenue so I can actually pay for that and then maintain that going forward? And that's a really important business decision that you'll have to make. Now, you can choose not to become CMMC compliant. That's your prerogative as a business owner, right? That you can do that in this country. However, if you don't become compliant, you cannot work with the DoD. Jason, you want to talk a little bit more about that part?
Yeah, I think that, we talked earlier about this phased rollout. And the DoD says by the end of phase 4, everyone's going to have to be CMMC, everyone's going to have CMMC compliance, right? They're going to need to be certified. So again, I like the analogy of the carrot and the stick, is that if you're a first mover on this, you can have first mover's advantage. And I know last time I spoke with here on this platform, I was talking about security clearances and getting an FCL, a facilities security clearance, and I talked about the expense that might take to get there. The same thing here. There's an upfront expense, but then again, first mover. If you get there first, you have some ability to gain market share, right? So again, it is one of those things where if it's part of your business strategy to do DoD contracts and you're trying to capture more, this is a way that you can set yourself apart from your peers by getting this. Again, there's an upfront cost, but again, that's a business decision of whether you do that. But at some point, if you want to do business with the DoD, you've got to get it done. And potentially, as we go further down the road, who knows what might happen? There might be more auditors that get that are able to certify. The cost may come down. The DoD might relax this. I don't see it, but they might. I don't see it though. I actually see it getting.
It changes, but I don't think it's going to relax.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to relax.
So, and I want to add a couple more things here, just sort of like with one eyeball watching the chat here, because a couple questions that were posed that were really weren't answered yet, to be fair. And again, please put your questions into the Q&A, not the chat itself, because the Q&A, we can kind of track that. So one of the questions that was posed was, and again, I'm not into the Q&A part yet, but, and we didn't talk about this, which is flow down, right? So Jason, talk a little bit about the flow down requirement. Does this only apply to primes or to subs, or what's the deal?
It's going to apply to subs, right? These clauses in your contract are mandatory flow down clauses. There are some clauses in that are not mandatory. You can do it if you want. But if you're a subcontractor, you already know that prime contractor is going to try to flow down as much as possible anyway. At least they should be. But these are mandatory flow down clauses. And again, the guidance that the DoD has put out in these rules in the comment section is, well, what do you expect as a subcontractor? Do you expect them to handle CUI? Okay, well, then they have to follow, either they have to be level 2, certified at the same level you as the prime are certified. There is a very small amount of level 2 that are going to be allowed to be self-assessed level 2s. That's going to be the minority, maybe 5%, I think is the term I heard. 95% are going to require that third-party certification, third-party audit. And so, but yes, the flow down is there. But say, for example, I'm the prime contractor, I'm flowing down something to a sub. I only expect them to have FCI. Well, they're only going to need to be level 1 certified. I'm not going to give them any CUI. We make that very clear in the subcontract, which means as you're going forward here, dealing with DoD contracts, your subcontracts are going to have to be, the language on that's going to have to be pretty tight and pretty clear about what's happening. Because remember, the prime, if you're a prime and you're subbing down, you are responsible, right? If your subcontractor gets CUI, you send them CUI, or they don't have their certifications, you are responsible. So you have to have some tight controls in those subcontracts as well to make sure warranty and representations and indemnification clauses are going to be robust in this, I would say, to make sure that that sub is following what they're supposed to do. But yes, these will be flowed down. It's a mandatory flow down requirement. And I expect to see that that's going to be an area where people are going to have to dust off their old subcontracts and teaming agreements and JVs to make sure that they've got that in there the way it needs to be.
And hope the question is whether, the prime is properly flowing down the correct contract requirements to their subs. I mean, let's hope that they are, right? And so there's something else I want to talk about as it relates to this. The question that's been asked before of me, and I think it's fair to address this here, is wait a second, we're now asked as a small business to kind of pay for all this? What the heck? What's going on? And here's the stark reality. Again, these requirements have been around for years, and the DoD has said, whether you're new to the defense space or not, these are now what you have to do. The landscape has changed. This is kind of and I don't want to call it pay to play because that's definitely not it. But the requirements are that these things have to be done, and the reality is that those come with a cost, right? And this is a business cost, and frankly, becomes a business decision as well. And like I said before, you can always decide to not, to not work with the DoD, and that's fine too, or to not comply, but then you can't work with the DoD because you are personally attesting as the owner of the company. You have to attest every year that you're still in compliance, and that is a personal attestation. So you don't want to find yourself on the receiving end of a lawsuit, right, by the DOJ that was filed for the DoD or referred to the DOJ. You don't want to find yourself on that side of it. That's legal trouble, and ain't nobody got time for that. You don't want to do that. So look, the opportunity is really quite large, right? But you have to think about in terms of what the expense and the cost is to play, if you will, in this space now, in the DoD space, because the stakes have changed. The requirements have changed, Again, the requirements changed years ago. And if you've been in the DoD for many years, and you've been dealing with COI and your contracts had DFAR 7012 in them, I would encourage all of you to go back to look at your contracts, and you haven't done anything about that. Technically speaking, Jason, back me up on this, you're in breach of contract.
Could be. Depends. I would tell you that sometimes the DoD puts this in as a full clause, right? And if you go through, DoD contracts, say, here's clauses incorporated, by reference, and here's clauses that are in, by full text. Well, it doesn't matter. I don't know why. Again, why do they do that? Why don't they just put all of them as incorporated by reference? Why don't they, some of them I think because they have, fill-in boxes, they got to incorporate it by full text and actually fill in the boxes. But sometimes this is incorporated by reference, and it might just be something as you zip through, you might not realize it's in there, but it's in there. And then I think it's going to be the default is you're going to see these clauses in a contract versus something that the DoD is going to pepper in from time to time. So recently we had a client who does exclusive COTS, right? So commercial items off the shelf, okay? They saw this clause in their contract, like, whoa, what's going on? Like, this is an exclusive COTS contract, and that's one of the things that doesn't apply to exclusive COTS contracts. So they called us, and we helped them out with that. But again, I think it's going to become the norm. I think that's the default position, is that these clauses are going to start being in there. And the number in it, and I'll say this: contracting officers and the rules that are promulgated have the authority to go back and do bilateral change to add these in. They can add it in at the renewal of an option year, right? So even if it wasn't in your contract previously, watch for those change clauses, watch for those bilateral changes. I even think they can do it unilateral if they want. But again, that may start popping up as well. So again, something to pay attention to, because we're going to start seeing this. I think the DoD is really moving forward like, hey, we've got this now. Our rules are passed, at least, the CMMC overall arching rule. The contract clauses aren't passed yet. They're still in their final period. But even in the comments too on the Federal Register, it says contracting officers can put this in now if they want, if they have the discretion to do it. So again, we can start seeing this happening sooner rather than later. And I'll say, yeah. Well, let me just, I think that kind of covers that. I don't know if there's anything else, Brian, that you wanted to cover there.
So I'll just add one more thing again, and kind of put a finer point on it from earlier, which is what I said, which is, look, things have changed. Cyber attacks are way up. The DoD knows that. Foreign adversaries are eating our lunch. They want to make sure that their information is protected. This is no longer, it's not optional. And for those of you who are on the call, I mean, I understand that some folks are upset, and I don't blame you whatsoever, right? Is how are we going to fund this? Well, that's part of it. And that's going to be, in a way, kind of a filter or a screen, right? So if you don't have enough revenue, or let's call it revenue and the margin from that revenue to pay for this, and it just doesn't make financial sense, then you have to make that decision ultimately. But that being said, sort of moving along here, if you do this, like Jason said earlier, and get on this early, and because your contract requirement for having this may not come out for a couple of years from your prime, then you can get ahead of this and kind of like amortize the cost out over time. You can make that happen. But I'll share with you quite frankly, and please don't take this the wrong way, but the head in the sand approach, or I think this is going to go away. Well, let's talk about that for a second, right? We just had an election, and there is some conversation in the ecosystem, or people tend to believe or hoping that, hey, we just had an election, we're going to have an incoming Republican administration, whether you're blue, red, or green, I don't care. This is not a political statement, but just know this: if you feel or think that the incoming administration will make a change and kill this, that's not the case. Actually, conference I'm at right now, there is conversation about that today from the DoD side of the House, and there is a broad bipartisan support around protecting the defense supply chain, the defense industrial base broadly. And just to be very clear, CMMC, the first version, started in 2018-19 under the first Trump administration. It was continued under the Biden administration, which of course is wrapping now. And under the next administration, we do not expect this to be killed off. So just beware politically. If you're feeling that deregulation is coming, this is all going to go away. This is national security, broad bipartisan support. Jason, would you agree with that, or any other thoughts on that side?
Yeah, I mean, my personal thoughts are, I agree with you on that, it's got broad support on both sides of the aisle. I don't see it going anywhere.
Right. So let's go ahead and jump into the Q&A section here. And I'm going to go ahead and advance the slide here and see if we have any questions we can answer. All right. So we're going to pop up the Q&A area. Bear with me for a hot second.
You want to do it, Brandon? You want me to help out?
Yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead and do it, and then just whoever is best appropriate to answer will answer. Sure, please do.
Awesome. So just want to say we have about 14 minutes left. We have quite a few questions. Once again, if we are unable to get to your question before this webinar is over, we'll make sure we get back to you at a later date. Okay. So first question: besides getting the certification, should businesses also buy insurance if it's available for this?
So I'll kind of grab this one. So besides getting certification for business, also buy insurance. Okay, so there's really no relationship here between the requirement to do this, but I will say this from a personal note, from a cybersecurity and a risk management perspective for your own business. I absolutely recommend that you purchase good cybersecurity insurance. Again, this is just meant to be informational, right? But what's called a standalone cybersecurity policy, which has certain requirements and mandates that those controls or policies or practices are actually implemented provably when you fill out your application. Be truthful in your application. So yes, but this has nothing to do with CMMC, to be very clear. Cybersecurity, cyber liability insurance is really there to protect you if you have what's called an incident, such as a data breach, data was stolen, or maybe you have fraud, financial fraud, wire fraud. But you have to be very careful when filling out your cyber liability insurance application that it's truthful. But it really won't help you with CMMC itself. Just to be very clear. Okay. So, do you want to hit the next question?
Absolutely. Thank you. Is supplier performance risk system self-certification requiring the upload of supporting documents or a POAM?
So, the supplier performance risk system called SPRS, which is a system maintained by the U.S. military, is requiring the upload of supporting documentation or a POAM. So typically what you have to do in this case is you have to upload 3 different things as we understand it. is your plan of action, the milestones. That's essentially what has not been done yet. In other words, you upload, first of all, your system and security plan, which is your policies, your processes. It's all written down, how you do things around cybersecurity within your company, within your defense contracting firm, right? That's called the system security plan. Then there's a plan of action and milestones. Those are the things that are not maybe finished yet, but this illustrates where you are. And the lastly is what's called the actual score, like how well of 110 points. We talked about that before, the 110 controls in this 171. Out of those 110 points, how many points did you get? And you want to upload that as well. And the short answer is those are all part of the documentation that's typically required, particularly on the maturity level 2. Okay, and maturity level 1, it's not. But they want to see at least your SPURS score, because policy and process is not meant to be illustrated, but they do want to know where you are broadly. So yeah, the short answer is yes, plus your system security plan, plus your SPURS score, SPRS score.
Yeah, and Brian, just real quick on that. Your plan of actions and milestones are not going to be available on every control, right? There are certain controls
that are mandatory. Yes.
Yeah, the government's like, you can't do this on a poem. So just remember that, right? Those are all buried in the rule. Obviously, we're not going to have time to go through and
yeah,
those out, but yeah, just
okay.
keep that in mind.
Great, thank you. What's the next question?
Awesome. Thank you. Does a contractor that sells toilet paper or janitorial services to the defense agency need to have cybersecurity certifications?
This is a good question for Jason.
Yeah, and I hate to give a lawyer answer, but it's going to depend, right? So contracts that are exclusively, right, and that's the key word here in the regulations, exclusively commercial items off the shelf are exempt from these requirements. But let's just say you're cleaning offices, and let's just say those offices have CUI, and you're going to be your people are going to be walking around those offices. Will the government say, hey, wait a second, I need this, and you're gonna have access to this information, you're going to be cleaning these desks, you're going to be around, potentially they're going to put that in. Potentially they're going to say this is not just going to be commercial services or a COTS item contract. There's some other things in there that may have you supply or do that are beyond that. And then number 3, CMMC is also going to apply also to that level 1 certification for federal contracting information. So I think overall, you're going to have probably be level 1, because those level 1 requirements are going to be, as Brian mentioned earlier, are part of that FAR clause. And that FAR clause, I think, is going to be found almost in every single contract, because it's very basic things. And if you have federal contract information, now you're going to have to go through and do this. So I would say, look at your contracts, see what's in your contracts. If you have a legal advisor that can maybe help you understand, like, hey, is this going to happen? Talk to your contracting officer, the Corps, just to see, like, hey, I have this contract. I don't think I should have to do this stuff. What do you think? Is this coming down the pipeline for me on these contracts? So just, yeah, I'd say that's probably the best way to go about it, because it's going to depend.
Awesome, thank you. What is CMMI, and how does it relate to CMMC and NIST?
Sure, I'll take that real quick. So CMMI is essentially what CMMC was based on loosely as a framework. So CMMI stands for Capability, Maturity, Model Integration. It was a process level integration training and appraisal program. So it's essentially sort of to make your systems, establish your systems, and make them better over time. So think of like a continuous improvement in a sense, right? And that's what CMMI is. And that's really also foundationally what CMMC as a cybersecurity maturity model certification, that C is important, right? Was based on as a framework, because it's always about ramping up, showing progress over time, which, by the way, the auditors want to see and are looking for, is showing that progress over time and that you maintain that level and are always improving if and when the requirement shows up.
Thank you. Does this apply for staffing agencies that have contracts with the DoD?
Jason?
Yeah, and similar to the question about janitorial services and supply contracts, it's potentially, right? It's so hard to say generally speaking, because unless the contract is exclusively COTS, again, and that's the determination that DoD is going to make, right? They're going to do a commerciality determination, and they may say, oh, we don't think this is exclusive costs, or unless it's, below the micro purchase threshold. But yeah, it's potentially going to apply. So again, this is one of those things that look through your contracts, see if you're seeing that DFARS clause 7012 in there already. If you see 7012 in your contracts now, you're going to see 7021, which is going to be, it's under revision right now. The clause exists, but 7021 is the CMMC certification program. There's also going to be a separate clause, it's not numbered yet, that talks about what level of CMMC certification you're going to need. But we're going to start seeing those roll out. I don't know the timeline on this because I think it's still in its final rulemaking. So we don't know the exact timeline, but it's safe to say early 2025, we're going to see those contract clauses come out, and contracting officers have the authority to, by change order, to put those into your contracts if they think that your contract involves FCI or CUI. So.
Thank you, Jason. You outlined the potential cost for M1 and M2. Is it safe to assume M3 would cost $150K, $150 to $200,000 based on the scale provided?
So I'll take this one. So the shorter answer is the good answer is actually no. Just by the way, M is as being loosely used for maturity level. So I think the person, I think this is Kevin, posted, yeah. So maturity level 1, again, estimated $30,000 to $50,000 in contractor investment, presuming nothing has been done before. This is really the assumption, right? The DoD's assumption of amount of money you're spending for CMMC is dramatically lower because, again, remember, DoD already assumed you did all the stuff previously. If you didn't do all the stuff, you got to do all the stuff and then get certified, right? And that's where all the cost comes in. Now, the cool part is that maturity level 2, right? That's to safeguard CUI. Requires in most cases 90 to 95% estimated cases, maybe 5 to 10% what's called a self-assessment, but that number is very low, vanishingly low, and that's probably going to get even lower because really what they want to see for CUI, the DoD really wants to see a third-party audit. Okay, so what happens with maturity level 3, right? When you have that additional bolt-on, remember we talked about the third Lego on top, that additional 24 controls, you would have to get a third-party assessment first. And that's where we're ending up between 100 and 150K at least, right? Depending on your organization. And there's a lot of variables here: complexity, size of the business, what kind of work you do, number of sites you have. There's a lot of variables, like Jason said, right? It depends. And the last part of it, the third piece, right, that gets you up to maturity level 3, you'd have to give a maturity level 2 assessment by a C3PAO, by an auditor. That be successful, and then maturity level 3. That's done through a department that's part of the DoD called the DIBCAC, right? We talked about acronyms before. That stands for Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, the DIBCAC, DIBCAC. They then come in, and that is at no charge to the contractor. If they have maturity level 3 requirements, will then come in and do that final piece of the assessment. And if you pass that, you will then be certified for maturity level 3. But that has no extra cost beyond maturity level 2 certification.
So thank you. A few more questions. They're still rolling in. We got about 4 minutes. Is there a list of what these 130 plus controls are that need to be implemented? I understand some aspects can be handled internally by companies and others will need to be outsourced. A list will help to evaluate the implementation plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would encourage everyone here to do, if you want to know more about this, I would encourage you to look up the following. Just look up NIST, NIST, space 800-171. That is a list of controls. And NIST 800-171A, that is the actual way of identifying these controls and what has to be done to implement these, right? These are relevant documents. The A is a supplement, kind of an appendix, right? I think it's called an appendix. And so look up those, and that's where you can get into all the nitty gritty. If you want to have some light reading over the weekend, 120 pages of content, dig in, have fun. But that's where you can find the actual information and then sort of sift through it. And then really you can identify whether your organization seeking, it's called Organization Seeking Assessment, or OSA, or the organization seeking certification, if you can pull that off, and you may decide to do a portion of that, right? Maybe we'll bring in a company that's going to do the compliance piece, but we'll do most of the implementation of closing the gaps, at least on the technical side. You can really have a combination of that, but that's where it's really important to work with an organization that's what's called an RPO, or Registered Provider Organization. to make sure that they know what they're talking about, that they have done some of this work. Remember, it's all new, right? So a lot of organizations are new to this. But hopefully that answers that question. You can look it up online, easily downloadable. I know we're only have 2
Awesome.
minutes left.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
This sounds a little like pay to play. Are there currently any plans to help subsidize the expense to small disadvantaged businesses?
Jason?
I'm not aware of any. And I know this has been a concern that has been raised in the comments of these rules. Like this is, it's a lot of money, right? And so there hasn't been anything that the DoD has signaled yet. I know that there are advocacy groups that that are going to be advocating for this to get some sort of subsidy, because again, you might drastically reduce who can be in the defense industrial base if you have this large hurdle that has to be crossed. And so I think that's something out there. So I'd say if you're part of a veteran service organization or other, kind of organizations that represent small businesses, potentially raise this as a concern and see if your agency or your organizations might be able to get some help there. But I'm not aware of anything other than they'll say you can use the cost accounting standards to do that. And I think what Brian mentioned earlier about trying to amortize that over the period of a contract, potentially that's a way to recover that. But yeah, Brian, I don't know if you're aware of anything.
No, I'm not. Unfortunately, this has been asked before, specifically in the rulemaking phase, and there was a public comment period. The DoD responded saying, no, this is not something for which we're paying. It's been existing for a long time, and this is what's required to be a defense contractor today. And they're taking a very fairly staunch and stark approach to this, right? And that's unfortunate the way it is. And just to clarify, again, you're all, hopefully all of your business owners, at least executives on the call here. Perhaps you're on the IT side of the house. It could be various different people that are here today. But I'll share with you that if you want to continue working with the DoD, you must do this. Okay. Again, there's no question about it. You have to do this, or you have to stop working with the DoD as a prime or a sub. Now, I'll just add this into there. If the financial lift is too heavy, there are definitely opportunities, like Jason alluded to. Perhaps going to your bank, getting an SBA loan and being able to pay that back within over 8, 10, 15 years, and having a fairly being able to service that debt, but ultimately preserve the ability to continue working with the DoD. But what's more important to you, right? Again, things have changed. Cyber attacks are up. The DoD cares about that, and now you have to show and prove, especially when you're safeguarding CUI, right, that level 2 or higher, that you're safeguarding that data. It's no longer enough to just say, I did it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's still some wonderful questions coming in, and I see it is 12 o'clock. I do respect everyone's time as well as our presenters as well. So we will get back with you at a later date as far as your questions. Give us like a week or two, please. And I see it's a couple of kudos, in the chat, for Brian and Jason. Thank you for this great information. It was mind blowing, but they definitely would like to be in touch with you guys soon. So, I definitely appreciate everybody attending today. Please fill out the survey at the end of this webinar. Let us know how we did today. On the screen, you can see Brian and Jason's email address. If you looking to contact them, please feel free to take that information down as we speak.
Feel free to screen, reach out, please.
Please do, definitely. And once again, please take the survey. Let us know how we did today. Just be mindful. We start our surveys off with strongly disagree. So, just don't go in there. Just keep clicking the button. If you strongly disagree, then that's fine, but just a heads up. So I hope everybody have a wonderful day, a wonderful Thursday. If you need anything, please feel free to reach out to us. And I will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Brian. Talk to you guys soon.
Thanks for having us, Curtis.
All right. Well, good day, y'all.